Hi, welcome to part 2 of episode 6 of our series on building a modular synth for live performance. In this one, we're going to go through the entire system that I built and designed module by module. Let's start with a high-level overview of this system. We have 8 channels coming in, 7 individual voices because the first voice is stereo, as you'll see in a sec. It goes to a stereo output, which then goes to a chain of 3 stereo effects units, a clouds, a 4ms dual looping delay, and a 2 HP reverb, before going to a busing system that then routes it to main outputs, a headphone output, and back to the inputs on the Bitbox over here so that we can record our wiggles. In fact, that's what I'm doing right now. The system is comprised of a Bitbox, which is primarily used for percussion duties, a radio music, which is used to create weird vocal effects, the verbose complex oscillator, the random source new timbral oscillator, a Platts, a Tides for bass duties, and a Braids to be able to create other strange percussion sounds. We'll go through each of these voices one by one and then hear how they sound mixed together. On the sequencing side, we have a whole plethora of stuff down here, all of which is working together to be able to send triggers, as well as note data, as well as other strange control voltage data to be able to make all of this stuff sound interesting. We have the Depfer A155 analog trigger sequencer. We have this Klee shift register sequencer that I built by hand from a kit. We have a mutable instruments grids, which is used to be able to do percussion duties. A Music Thing modular Turing Machine with a couple of expansions from it, a RYO Penta 5-step sequencer, an Erica Synth's Woggle Bug, and then a whole bunch of clocking over here. A Pamela's Workout, which is the primary clock and heartbeat of the whole system, a buffered mult that is used to allow us to be able to distribute clock signals to different places, and then a couple of clock dividers here, and then finally a clock multiplier here on the end. All of the materials get tied in here to this Depfer performance mixer, this 8-channel mixer, which then culminates here in this mix output, which then goes to an IntelliGel Audio I/O, the headphone bus, and as I said, the Bitbox for recording. So let's start with the Bitbox. This fine sampler is primarily used for percussion duties, although as you can see we're currently using it to record what's going on here, so we're not going to be able to see the home screen where the percussion sounds are triggered. But take it as read that those sounds are in here. If we take a look here, we have a couple of inputs for kick, snare, accented snare, open and closed hi-hat. As you'll see in my system, the percussion is a combination of switches that I can set myself, as well as other triggers that are being set by the system itself. I can mix and match these in any way that I want to be able to have more or less control over the triggers that are going into the Bitbox. So let's hear what it sounds like from the top. The sequencer switches that I have here, this top row, up is kick, middle row is nothing, bottom is snare, and then this is closed hi-hat and open hi-hat. Those are simply general terms because, of course, I'm using weirder sample sounds here, so therefore things will sound different, but those are the primary functions. So we're going to turn on the Pamela's, which is going to get the sequencers working. Okay, let's start by simply turning on a kick pulse. Simple enough. Let's put on another one. And of course, the quintessential we can put in some snares for accent, or Martian snares, I suppose. Now here's what's really cool about this. I'm going to take out the snares for a sec, and I'm going to simplify the kick drum. And now I'm going to mix in the Mutable Instruments Grids kick drum. So it's going to be adding additional kick triggers to what's going on there. I have the the primary triggers from both of those going into an OR up there, and then the output of the OR is what's actually directly triggering the Bitbox. So therefore we can mix those signals together. I can make it a really complex thing, and in fact turn off mine so that all we're hearing is the grids. I can bring it down. Or I can turn it off and then bring back my own. And then maybe turn on a little bit of the grids as an accent here or there. Now, one thing I forgot to mention about the grids is that I have a couple of very slow LFOs over here that are connected into the map X and map Y parameters of the grids. So it's never simply sitting on a single rhythm. It's slowly morphing through all of the different patterns that are inside of the grids to create something that's continuously changing and undulating. So let's add in a little snare. And if we want to make sure we always have a snare, say here, then we can do the same thing with our hats. So we've got regular closed hats and then an open hat there, or a weird sound anyway. And then we can do the same thing by adding more of that from the grids. Becomes really easy to, say, take out the snare and just have a hi-hat and kick pattern. Or take out the hat altogether, just have it being triggered from the grids, be able to make it as dense or as simple as I want. Or turn it off altogether. So here's this notion that I'm partially driving the bus on my own, but in addition, the system is doing it as well, and I can relinquish as much or as little control to the system as I possibly want. Okay, now let's take a look at the second voice, which is the radio music. Now this is just a wonderful sample playback device to allow you to be able to play samples of whatever you want. It's great for musique concrète. In this case, I have a bunch of vocal samples in there, recordings of different things. But you can really use it to play back anything that you want. The way that I have it set up, we have the radio music right there. It's going into the VCA right here. I'm using the rise and fall time within the function as the envelope generator to control the radio music. So it's going into a VCA to be able to open and close the amplitude of the radio music on the way down into the mixer. Now, I can do this a couple of different ways. I can just turn on the cycle. But it's more fun to actually use a separate clock to be able to do that. So I use my clock multiplier here, this Ratch controller from Depfer, to be able to generate triggers, to be able to have that trigger sounds at a fairly periodic way. So let's listen to it go slowly first. And we can adjust the rise and fall to make it tighter. Just have it be sort of an interesting little tight percussive sound, or we can open it up. And adjust between linear and exponential. We can even just hear the whole thing.
To be sure. Quietly.
I think it's fun when you hear just a little bit of the voice. So now let's speed that up. There we go. Now, so we can get a groove going with simply the voice and the percussion part. Create all sorts of different subdivisions against it.
spoil everything.
So that could even sort of act as a little hi-hat or a little percussive element like that. Or we can slow it back down. And then finally, we can just simply turn it off by turning off the triggers completely. Okay, now we come to the two primary melodic voices. So the way that this works is that I have the two melody voices per se based on the verbose complex oscillator here and the random source new timbral oscillator there. Each of them have a couple of primary outputs of different flavors of their waveforms going into each of these variable slope filters here, these random source filters that I built. These are awesome because they have a mix send right here, so I can go back and forth between different flavors coming out of the same oscillator, okay? So it's coming in here, it's going out there, and then it is going into the VCA. Channel 1 of the maths is providing the envelope generation for the complex oscillator. Channel 4 of the maths is providing the envelope generation for the new timbral oscillator and for this filter here. So let's start with the triggers for these melody elements. In the same way that I'm using the trigger section of this sequencer up here to be able to trigger the Bitbox, on the bottom I'm using the triggers here in my Klee to be able to trigger the verbose and the new timbral oscillator. So anything that I flip up here on this end, turn that on. We can hear triggering the verbose. Now that's not a very musical sound yet, but we can fix that. There we go. And then we have a straight up oscillator with our filter. We can mix between a couple of different waveforms coming out of the verbose, which is very cool. Let's leave it there for now. And as I said, we can adjust the envelope on the maths to do whatever we want. Now, in addition to generating the amplitude envelope, I'm also using the envelope output from the maths to be able to control the voltage controlled filter here a little bit. So we're giving it a little bit of wow sound that goes in tandem with the amplitude. It would be nice to be able to have a separate envelope for the filter, but we don't have room for that. So we're doing it this way. Now, a couple of things. So the way that the system works is that this row here is the primary control voltage note data for the complex oscillator, and this one here. So this series of sequences and this series of sequences are the primary generators of that music. In addition, we have the Turing Machine, which is also adding randomness to that, but we're going to turn it off for now so that we're only hearing what it is that's going on here instead. Go away, Turing Machine. Okay, so let's start the sequencer going again. Right now it's just playing this. It's playing nothing. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now let's add additional voltage information down here, which is being so this sequencer and that sequencer are being added together in this precision adder. that precision adder's output is then going into one channel of the ornament and crime, which is being used as a quantizer. And that quantized voltage is what is going into the volt per octave input on the verbose. So here's what's really neat about this. We can hear this melody going along, but if I hit this button on the clay, it will reset it to the first step again. And what that will do will be to generate a different kind of phase between these two melodies, therefore creating something similar but different. Let's try it. Do it again. And then what's super cool about the clay is because it's a shift register sequencer, we can actually have a couple of different steps of the sequencer being generated at the same time, creating yet more complexity. Now we can change the rhythmic pattern if we want. And if we turn that off, it'll become much more sparse again. So now, for additional fun, we can bring in the Turing Machine as well. So this is another system that is generating additional random notes that we like to be able to make it even more complex. I currently have the Turing Machine set to 12 steps. We can set it to whatever we want. So this is the generative type of melody creation that I really like. Because of the fact that it's going into a quantizer, which is quantizing it to a Dorian mode, it's hard for you to really go too wrong in terms of creating consonant melodies, but at the same time, it's creating a lot of different things that you're not generally expecting. It's almost like a random sauce. Okay, so now that we have that, that's wonderful, and it's a very cool sounding oscillator, but let's add some voltage control to make it more interesting. So I've got LFOs and various things coming into the timbre input, the FM input, and the control voltage input of the modulating oscillator over on this side. For more information, a really deep dive on the verbose complex oscillator, I have a separate video that I've done on that. So feel free to go check that out. But let's listen to it and just see what happens when we start bringing up the CV inputs to the verbose as well. There we go. Maybe something like that. And then maybe the FM input. And with a flick of a couple of knobs, we've gone from something that's really consonant to something that's pretty out. Let's see if we can find something sort of as a halfway middle ground. Something that's just got a little bit more grit to it. Oh, because this is in FM mode. There, let's turn it into amplitude modulation mode instead. Now we've got a sound that's just got something that sounds like distortion. And we can bring in... The FM input is screwing with the frequency, the actual pitch. But we can do this and be able to have something that Goes from a slow LFO ourselves a little video game sound there. Okay, let's move on to the new timbral oscillator. Okay, now let's take a look at the new timbral oscillator. Very similar idea here. So I have this bottom row of control voltages here generating pitches for it, as well as the sequencers on this side. To be able to make the new timbral oscillator trigger, we use these triggers down here. So I set this and again we have a couple of different flavors of waveform there. That's fun because the variable oscillator the variable waveform coming out of here is being triggered by a control voltage, giving a sound that changes quite a bit. We can also generate FM here. So if we wanted to, we could have very clangorous sounds or sounds that are a lot more clear. So let's do the same thing that we did before and let's start messing around with a melody. So between the voltage control of the frequency cutoff of the filter and what we're doing with the variable waveform, we're creating a lot of different colors without having to use our hands at all. Now let's start playing around by adding and I'll hit the reset button and we'll get a different phase melody between those two sequences. So cool. You can get so many different flavors of melody so quickly. Let's reset all the sequences. And Maths channel 4 is being used as the attack decay envelope for that oscillator. So if we pan that one to one side and the complex oscillator to the other side, let's see how they interact with each other. So if we go and tune those up carefully, since they're analog oscillators, before our performance or before our recording, they'll be nicely in tune and they'll work together in a really interesting way. Now let's move on to the bass drone. For the bass drone sound for this thing, I can't think of anything nicer than the Mutable Instruments Tides Tidal Modulator. So I just wanted these long, interesting bass sounds with all of the different timbral controls of the tides being used by LFOs and woggle bugs and random generated ways to be able to generate control voltages. Now, this too is on a sequence, but it's on a much slower tempo. So I'm using this Penta 5-position sequencer here to be able to generate the pitches, which is essentially the chord progression of our melody. Maybe we'll add one more. So, for a very cool Tangerine Dream kind of effect, why don't we bring in one of our melody oscillators and have it play the same melody over and over again while the chord progression is changing in the bass. See if I can tune that up. So you can see how those elements work together to be able to create some really interesting stuff. So that brings us to the plats. I've already gone into detail on how this model works in another video, so check that out if you want more about that. However, what I like about it is that it is a digital wavetable synthesizer that has a lot of different synthesis algorithms, and we can switch between those different algorithms on the fly very quickly by triggering this parameter right here, the model parameter. So if we take a listen to that right now, you can hear that as it's being triggered, it's triggering a different sound virtually every time. Now we still have some control over it ourselves. We can make it a little duller. Change the wavetables that it looks through. But we've got something going on all the time to make it really cool. Now, the note information for the plats is being generated here by the volts, which is a voltage sequencer add-on to the Turing Machine. So right now it's playing the single note over and over. There we go. We get a few notes going through the Turing Machine and we can hear that it's changing the pitch as well. Just a crazy, cool, interesting sounding timbre. So that brings us to the last voice in our system, which is this Braids. Originally I had an analog noise generator there going into a filter, and while it was cool, I couldn't get enough difference in sound to really make it worthwhile. What I love about the Braids is that it has its own attack decay envelope built in, and so therefore I can generate sounds and adjust the envelope at the same time. So what I am doing with this is the follows. the Klee sequencer, I have been switching these triggers to the top position or the bottom position to trigger either the new timbral oscillator or the verbose complex oscillator. However, what's interesting is if you have it in the middle, then what happens is that it is spitting out triggers onto another bus, bus 2. And that bus is what's triggering the braids. Let's listen to it real quick. So with none of the other triggers on, it's triggering every single step to the braids. However, what's cool is as we pull these triggers away to be able to use them for the verbose or for the random source, those particular pulses are being taken away from the braids pattern. So instead of having a lot of stuff hitting at the same time, it becomes the absence of the patterns of those other oscillators. So let's see what happens if, let's turn a bunch of them on at the same time. Let's turn off the Turing Machine. Now, maybe a couple more of those. So we can hear we've got these other patterns going. Let's turn those off. And listen to that. So now instead of it simply being absolutely every pulse, it's the pulses that are not being used by those other two oscillators. I think that is such a cool thing. Now, in addition, of course, we are using control voltages to adjust the timbre and the color. And we can adjust and just go through and randomly pick different sounds from here as we like. Let's use this bell sound, and then we'll go in here and we'll quickly adjust the attack and the decay, which is something we can do on the fly. So that becomes a really interesting, cool sounding percussive element. Tons of fun. Pick a different timbre. And you can see how quickly we have all of these different ways to be able to generate random improvised rhythms and sounds on the fly, just like that. So we're coming to the end of our thing here. We've now gone through all of the different noise generators and the sequencers and control voltages that are triggering them. But we have one more trick up our sleeves, which is this. Once it all goes into the mixer, it comes out of the mixer and goes into clouds, and then from clouds into the dual looping delay, and then out of the dual looping delay, and then into this reverb unit before going out. And we can adjust each of these things on the fly to be able to create drones and delays and all sorts of really interesting things like that to be able to change it up even more. So let's go through and just listen to clouds first. So we'll just leave that strange sound that we were just making. We'll bring up the blend of clouds. then adjust the pitch. So we are heading out of rhythm land and into straight up weird sound land. Let's unfreeze it. Mix the two of them together. Bring down the pitch of the grains. And there's so much you can get just out of this. Back to our original rhythm. Let's turn off some of this. Thin it out a little bit. And now let's go into the delay. So right now the default is that it's all dry, but all of a sudden we can start mixing in delayed versions of it and adjusting the time on either side so that we get a really interesting stereophonic spread. And then as we increase the delay times, we can start increasing the feedback and adjusting the mix all the way to wet. And we can start getting some pretty interesting delays. Turn it backwards and back out to create total chaos. Bring it back down and bring in some clouds. And before you know it, you've got fireworks. Now, let's end our piece. Oh yeah, and of course it's finally going into the verb here to be able to give us some reverb. I completely ran out of space, so I just got a 2 HP device to be able to do that. So let's finish our piece by going straight all the way to wet. Bring the feedback down. Turn off the sequence. Slowly bring this down. Bring the feedback down, so this will be the final run through it. And that is the power of creating a modular system. You create something in your own image, you fool around with modules that you think are interesting, you experiment, you change, you iterate, and before you know it, you have an improvisational platform that can take you to all sorts of different places. That's why I love this stuff so much. So that was it for part 2 in showing you how this system works. If you want to hear it in a more musical context, then check out the next video. I'm going to just do an improvisation on the system. Let's take it out for a spin and make some music.